Hi, I'm Kt McFarland, and I'm coming to you in a way that I didn't really expect initially. I was hoping to meet a lot of you around the country because had planned book signings at events and places in all the major cities in the country. And then the pandemic hit. My book came out at the last couple of days in February. It debuted at CPAC. And then a couple of days later, the pandemic hit. And so I've been unable to travel around the country to meet you in person and to talk to you and share my stories and hear your stories. But I'm very happy that Premier Collectibles has allowed me this opportunity to come and talk to you in this new way via Zoom. And I've got some questions for you. I'm going to talk to you about my book, about why I wrote the book and what's in it, answer some of the questions that a few of you have already submitted. And then for others of you who haven't had an opportunity to submit questions, please send them in. And I'll try to get to as many as I can. And if I don't get through all of them, at least I've had an opportunity to hear from you and to think about the questions that are on your mind. So this is going to take about an hour. Settle in, and we'll have a nice chat together. I'm coming to you, this is really beautiful, right? I'm coming to you from my house in Long Island, and that's the conservatory where I wrote my book, where we have our meals. It's full of plants, and I'm a frantic gardener in addition to being a foreign policy nerd. So this is a little bit about my personal life, and I'll tell you a little bit more later. But the reason I wrote this book is it really is my journey over decades in the foreign policy world. I first started working in government when I was 18. I was from a working class family in Madison, Wisconsin, and got a scholarship to go to college. I went to GW, but I needed to work to supplement it. So I got a part-time job working, believe it or not, in the basement of the White House in the National Security Council Situation Room. And my job was, I was the night shift secretary for Henry Kissinger in 1970, 69 and 70 during the Nixon administration. And so at a very young age, I was able to work right next to some of the great minds and some of the most important figures of our time. And my career then spanned decades. I worked for 7, almost 8 years for Henry Kissinger, first with President Nixon, and then after he resigned with President Ford. Then I went to graduate school, Oxford, MIT, and then came back to Washington and worked for President Reagan at the Pentagon. I did that for a number of years and then left in the middle 1980s. I mean, we had won the Cold War. I was a Cold Warrior. I was a nuclear weapons expert, and we had won the Cold War. So I left Washington, got married, retired, and raised 5 children. And I was done. I figured my war was won and I was done until September 11th. We were living in New York. We had some friends who died that day. And it was pretty clear to me that I'd been so blessed with a background in these subjects that I really ought to get back into the field. And in any event, my 13-year-old daughter, then 13-year-old daughter, said, as only teenage daughters can, "Mom, are you just going to sit around with your girlfriends? The country's under attack." And so she kind of shamed me into going back to work. And I did. I started doing public speaking. I did some writing. I ran for the US Senate against Hillary Clinton, lost, as to be expected, and then joined Fox News as their national security analyst. And that's what I'd done for years. And then, but my thinking about foreign policy had really evolved, because although I thought America was in a great place in the 1980s and even up to the early 1990s, we kind of lost our way after that. And we were so focused in the 21st century, we're so focused in the Middle East, that we lost track of what was really happening and a greater strategic threat to the United States, which I thought was coming from Asia. The rise of China and the way China was behaving in the international arena, and particularly with regard to trade. So I was dissatisfied with the Republican foreign policy establishment, a Republican obviously, but I was very dissatisfied with them because I thought they were in the wrong place. They were so focused on the Middle East that they lost track of what really was going to matter to America in the long run, and that was Asia. And I also became very disaffected with a lot of the economic policies. More and more taxes, more and more government regulation, more and more strangulation of the American economy and American innovation, that we were in a funk. And so by about 2014, 15, I looked around and, I really wasn't very excited by the field I saw. I had advised presidential candidates for decades, and I probably know all the Republican presidents personally, and certainly the ones who ran for president. But then when Trump came along, I thought, oh, this is kind of interesting. Here's a guy who doesn't even need the job. He's plenty rich. He's been successful in other ways. And I found that he had been very right on a lot of foreign policy issues, particularly on the Middle East, the war in Iraq, the Iran nuclear deal, and particularly when he talked about China, because he understood that with time, the Chinese would replace the United States as the most powerful country in the world economically, potentially militarily, and it was time for an American president to stand up to China. So I supported President Trump. I was one of the only foreign policy experts in the country to do so. But I really understood where he was coming from and the policies that he was formulating. He really didn't formulate them in depth. That was up to people like me. But I've really understood the voice that he was speaking to. You know, I've talked to him about this, and I've talked to other people, and Don Jr. and Eric Trump and Ivanka and Jared Kushner, and asked them, you know, what was it like on the campaign trail? Because I didn't join the campaign. I was still at Fox News. And a picture that emerged was that Trump ran initially because he looked at America and he said, this is a broken company. It needs fixing with better leadership. I know how to do that. I've done it my whole career. But when they started going from city to city and people showed up for these rallies, tens of thousands of people, no advance notice, no effort to get out the vote. It was almost passed by word of mouth. Then a human face went on it. And I think that was when Trump understood what some people in the country, the silent majority, call them what you will, that there were a lot of Americans who've been left behind. And some of our hardest working Americans had been left behind. And the American dream that they always thought was theirs was increasingly out of reach for them and out of reach for their children. And their schools were crummy. The infrastructure was collapsing. They were working one or two jobs to try to make ends meet. And it's just everything about their lives wasn't what it was supposed to be. It wasn't the deal. It wasn't the American dream that we all, I think, were raised on. And particularly galling was that when people complained about it, they were meant to feel guilty, that somehow they were not they didn't have the right attitude for America. So that's why I supported Trump. I mean, I knew, warts and all, that it was going to be problematic in some ways, but I supported him because not of what he said, but what he did and the policies that he would formulate. And I was very happy to join his administration. And to me, the most important parts of the Trump doctrine, if you will, are really three things. One, make America great again. Well, people throw that all around. It's a terrific line. But what does it mean? It meant the same thing it did in 1980 when Ronald Reagan used that slogan, make America great again, understanding that American strength is in our innovation, it's in our people, it's in our system of government, and it's in our economy. Because if America isn't a prosperous nation, it's very difficult for us to be a functioning and successful democracy. So the first priority President Trump had, like President Reagan, who I worked for in the 1980s, fix the economy, cut regulations, cut taxes, streamline government. And then once you have economic growth, which they had right away, then you can use that economic power to do the second thing, which is to put America first, and use that economic power as leverage to renegotiate trade agreements, to renegotiate security agreements. And the reason it was so important to do this was because at the end of World War II, when our international system was created by us, it was at the expense of the United States. I mean, we looked around the world, we looked at Europe and it was devastated. We looked at Asia, Japan, Korea, Philippines, they were devastated. And so we lent a helping hand. We helped underwrite their economies and we helped subsidize their security. And we did it with the objective that once these countries got back up on their feet, they would be allies of ours and they would be trading partners and we would never have to fight another world war. And that was a brilliant conception and it worked fabulously, but it was never meant to last forever. All of those countries, Japan, Korea, Germany, Britain, France, they were all doing very well indeed, and they no longer needed the helping hand, and we really could no longer afford it. So the second part of his doctrine was put American interests first. And there's nothing really unusual about that. I mean, do you think the Chinese put anybody but China's interests first? Or other countries? You're supposed to put your own interests first. The next thing, and the one that really was resonated with me, was his policy of peace through strength. I mean, I worked for President Reagan when he came up with the peace through strength slogan and policy. And it was never meant to be peace through war or peace through capitulation or peace through conquest. It was peace through strength. And America gets its strength, not only military strength, but economic strength, moral strength, diplomatic strength, the strength of our people, our unique population. So all those things together was the sort of formula that I thought made a lot of sense. So what I write about in my book, I really break the book into 3 parts. And the first part is what I've just described: why I left the Republican foreign policy community, the Republican establishment, which I had been a central figure of for decades, and why I threw in with the populist and nationalist Donald Trump. Because I think he was the only guy who understood the future. Most of the other people were looking at the past. Well, the past was no longer available to us. Focus instead on the future. The second part of my book that is my experiences in Washington. Now, most people who are in government, they leave, they write a book, they talk about all the terrific things they did, and all the dumb things that happened were because the president never took their advice. Mine is a little different. I describe really the chaos of the early days of the Trump administration. I mean, President Trump, because he really ran against a lot of the foreign policies of the Bush and Obama administration, he wasn't going to choose the typical old foreign policy or economic policy or security policy, all the experts that normally would have jumped into a Republican administration. He wanted different people. And by doing that, it meant it would be pretty chaotic because there were a lot of people who were new to government. So when the first time I interviewed with President Trump, it was right after the election. And I already briefed him a couple of times on foreign policy issues, so we knew each other. And I sat down with him and we talked about several jobs: the United Nations job, the National Security Council job. And when I left, I then sat down with the incoming Chief of Staff, Reince Priebus. And I said, well, these are the jobs I'm interested in. And they said, well, these are the ones we're thinking of you for. And then as the more they talked, Reince Priebus, Steve Bannon, and others, I realized, gosh, these guys have no idea how the White House works. And so I started asking him, well, what your jobs are as Chief of Staff and president, and they didn't. And I thought, oh my gosh, these guys really have no idea the buzzsaw they're going to run into, because President Trump, I think, as a businessman, he assumed that once you bought the company, once you won the election, that you were in charge, that people would take your orders, that they would follow your direction. And if not, you fired them, right? You're fired. Well, it didn't happen that way because the bureaucracy can't be fired. Bureaucrats, they're there forever. They can't be fired. They have job security for life. And the attitude is often, presidents come, presidents go. We're here forever. We'll wait this guy out. And I think that all of us, myself included, just had and counter-revolutionary, shall we say, the Washington establishment would be. Why? Because President Trump, he wanted to drain the swamp. He didn't want the same old. And guess who the swamp were? The swamp were the same old. So they set on him at the very, very beginning, even before the inauguration, and went after General Flynn, went after President Trump, went after me, went after others. I think, as we're now finding out, it was really a coup from within the government. It was the highest levels of the intelligence community, probably even the highest levels of the Obama administration. And they set out from the very beginning with the Russia hoax, with the other efforts to really so hamper President Trump that he would be unable to govern successfully. I mean, I think that the end, it's the Washington elites who decided the American people goofed. In 2016, the American people made a big mistake, that the American people elected the wrong person. So they were going to undo the election. They couldn't do it legally. They couldn't do it with electoral votes, but they set about doing it as a matter of operating. And so they set off on this merry chase that they took the country on for 3 years, for the Washington establishment. And in that, I would include the bureaucrats, sort of professional politicians, and particularly the Washington media. And they beat to death the Mueller investigation, the Russia hoax, which we're increasingly finding out is a hoax, that right from the beginning, they knew there was nothing there. They pursued it anyway. So the second part of my book, I write a lot about that. Not only the policies of the Trump administration, policies towards China, towards North Korea, towards Russia, towards Europe, but I write about my own experiences at the hands of the Mueller investigation. You know, the headlines have all been about General Flynn, but I was General Flynn's deputy. And when the Mueller investigation went after him, they came right after me. And they pressured me. They did all the same things that you've probably read about. They did to General Flynn. Well, they were doing the same thing to me because they had lined me up to sort of be this number two to General Flynn. In fact, in a lot of circumstances, their questioning led me to believe that they were lining me up to be the conduit, to be the intermediary between President Trump and General Flynn and the Russians. So during this whole period of time, it was a very difficult time for me. I left government. I was at home at my house in Long Island, and I get a phone call from the FBI saying, "Hi, it's the FBI. Can we come in? We're right outside your door." So I look out the window. Oh my gosh, there are two FBI agents. So I left, and in fact, we were meeting right in this very room. So I let them in, and I said, "Well, what are you here for?" And they said, "Well, we just want to ask Mueller investigation. We just want to ask you a couple of questions about Russian interference and during the campaign." And I said, "Well, do I need a lawyer? Are you like investigating me for something?" They said, "Oh, no, not at all. You don't really need a lawyer. I mean, we can't force you not to get a lawyer, but you really don't need a lawyer." And so me, Girl Scout that I am, I said, "Well, I want to find out what the Russians were up to as much as anybody. So yeah, let me help, let me cooperate with you." Well, we spent hours and hours. We had a second meeting, we had a third meeting. I finally got a really good lawyer, by the way, because it was pretty clear that they were lining me up for what's called a perjury trial. They wanted me to plead guilty to crimes I didn't commit. They seized my records. They seized my telephone logs, my emails, my text messages. They had copies of everything. And then they were looking through the copies and they were sort of quizzing me. "Well, on the 29th of December, you had a phone call with so-and-so. What did you say?" I didn't remember if it was on the 29th or the 30th. And I would ask them, "Well, can I see the document you're talking about?" "No, that's not how this works." So they were really setting me up to trip me up, and then they could turn around and charge me with perjury, which I think is what they did with General Flynn. So I write about this at great length and how difficult it was for me personally, and I think for the nation, and the tactics they used. And I hadn't talked to General Flynn since he had resigned for various legal reasons, but the tactics were all the same. You don't need a lawyer. We're going to control what you see as far as your documents and calendar. We're going to quiz you on things. And if you get it wrong, we're going to threaten to charge you with perjury. And if you don't plead guilty to perjury, we're going to bankrupt you because you have to pay for your lawyers, which can run into the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in the case of General Flynn. So that was the experience that I had. At the end, I was so beaten down after 30 or 40 hours of investigations and questioning by the Mueller, crack Mueller lawyers and FBI agents. But I finally turned to my lawyer and I said, "There's another subpoena. What more can they ask me? I've already told them everything I know 20 times. What else is there to say?" And my lawyer said, "Well, they have a narrative. They have a narrative of Russian collusion, and they either want you to plead guilty to a crime you didn't commit, or they want to have you implicate President Trump or General Flynn in crimes." I mean, that's their narrative. That's their position. And until you give them that, they're just going to keep coming after you. And so I turned to my husband and I said, "Oh, I'm going to spend the rest of my life defending myself for crimes I didn't commit. Just tell me what to say and I'll say it." And my husband, who's of 35 years, said, "No, you can't do that." And I said, "But we're going to lose our retirement. We're going to go broke." And he said, "No, you just got to do the right thing. You can't plead guilty to crimes you didn't commit." So that's what we conveyed to the Mueller people. And at a certain point, when they realized they weren't going to get from me what they wanted, they left. And then they went after, porn star mistresses and Trump's taxes and all the rest. So that's the second part of my book. I talk about the abuse of power, really, by the intelligence community, the Mueller investigation, and the media, because the media is in the middle of this. it wouldn't survive. These constant attacks against President Trump and other leaders don't survive without the media quoting their anonymous sources and making this claim or that accusation. But the third part of my book, and this is the one I really take great pride in, after this was all over and the Mueller investigation said, well, we're not going to charge KT with a crime, my husband, who's retired, he and I left the country. We left America and we went to the most obscure, remote part of Western Scotland, to the islands of the Hebrides Islands. There was no Wi-Fi, no telephone, no television, no internet, no cell phones. And so I was just by myself. And I tried to, sort of as Alan says, to get my feet under myself. I tried to figure out what had happened to me. In my career, I figured was over. But what was happening to the country? Is this where we had gone to, where we have cabals and coups and government officials being dragged down with lies and innuendos? What's wrong with America? And after a couple of weeks and months of reflection, I came to a conclusion which gave me actually some real hope, even in these dark times. And that is that America, we're going through a revolution right now. It's a political revolution. And the founding fathers wanted us to have these political revolutions. And in fact, they expected we would have them. And they wrote it into the Constitution. And because they understood human nature. And they understood that if a government is ever going to be a government by the people, that they would eventually, periodically, would have to really overthrow the ruling class, because it is the nature of governments and government officials to want power and to stay in power and to accumulate more power. So the founding fathers, having to fight a revolution of their own in the battlefield, in the Revolutionary War, they gave us the ability to fight a revolution politically at the Electoral College and the voting booth. And so I then went through American history and I said, well, have we gone through these periods before? Everyone says, oh, it's never been worse than this. Yeah, it has. It's always been worse than this. I mean, and so that I realized that every 40 years, somehow America goes through political revolution. So we went through one in 1776. We went through one 40 years later in the 1820s, 1830s, because Andrew Jackson was the new president. And we had the Jacksonian Revolution. The country had changed. It had expanded. We had had immigration. So the people in Washington governing were very different from the people of the nation. Then at 40 years later, we had the Civil War. And again, it was the establishment in Washington that wasn't getting the job done. They weren't really reflecting the needs of the people. They weren't solving the people's problems. So flash forward another 40 years, we had the Industrial Revolution in 1900, and Teddy Roosevelt was president. He was a revolutionary, and he changed the nature of government and the people who were there. And then 40 years after that, we had the Great Depression, we had World War II, and Franklin Roosevelt. 40 years after that, Ronald Reagan came in the Reagan Revolution. And I realized that I had been right to support President Trump's policies because he was the next revolution. It was a revolution of the people in the country who turned to Washington and said, you work for me, I don't work for you, and you're not getting the job done. So the revolution showed up in a couple of ways. On one hand, to the conservatives, it was Donald Trump was their candidate. But Bernie Sanders was equally a revolutionary from the other side. He represented people who also felt that government wasn't getting the job done. They just had a very different idea than President Trump and I had of how to solve it. But what I realized in all of this was how important it is for Americans to have a revolution, to have a political revolution. And when we go through these periods, they're always horrible. People yell at each other, if people even fight with each other. We've had some of them have been actual combat, like the Civil War, like the Revolutionary War. In other times, they've been economic wars. And other times, they've been social or demographic. And why is that? It's because America is a constantly evolving society. It's not just because of immigration, but we have innovations in technology. We have demographic changes. We have geographic changes. It used to be the majority of the population was east of the Rocky Mountains or west of the Rocky Mountains, or it was in the south. We move around the nation And we have always done that. And so the country changes, but government sort of sticks in. Special interests prevail. And the people who are in government sort of, they kind of fix it so that they can stay in government. And the only way you get them out is by a revolution. So the end of my book, and I would like to read a little bit of it to you when we finish. I talk about how I'm quite optimistic about the future. It's crummy right now, and we all know it. We're divided like we've never been in my lifetime. But I think we get through this. I don't know how, I don't know who, but I do think if we look at American history, we always have. There's no reason to think that the 6th or 7th time we wouldn't get through it again. So I ended my book on a real note of optimism, despite my personal experience, despite what's going on in Washington, despite the military, despite the media, the weaponized media, despite all of it, I really think we're going to be okay. So I've rattled on long enough. I would like to start with some questions, if you don't mind. And again, if you want to, go down to the chat, send me a question, and I'll get to it. I hope I'll get to it, and I'm going to call your name out, or not call your name out as you want. But while I do that, I'm going to start signing books, because the whole point of this is that you're getting a book that's signed. So this is me, and this is my book, Revolution, and it's a terrific read, and I'm sure that you want a signed copy of it. So I'm going to start signing as we do this. Okay, so I'm going to read out the questions, and I'm going to sign the books to these people as I read out the question. So the first question is from Kathy from Hendersonville, Tennessee. Do you still have hope for our continued democratic republic? Well, Kathy, I'm writing your book now. I really do, because from what I've just said, enough people want this to succeed. The people who are getting in the media, of course, are the ones who have their own little axis to grind. But the majority of Americans want this to work. And I think that as long as that happens, and as long as there are good people in this nation who stay engaged and stay involved and continue to educate their children, even if their governments don't, that yes, I do think that there's hope. And I sure hope so, because, if there isn't, then it just means that we, not just Americans, but we humans, are unable to govern ourselves. So Kathy, let me just sign my name here. Okay, you got it. I would say, though, if I can just expand upon this, of why I think self-government is so important, is, and don't think I'm too corny, but I think that when the Declaration of Independence really says it probably better, when they describe that mankind has the right to govern himself. And I think that right to govern yourself comes really, if you look at the Judeo-Christian concept of a soul. I think if you have a soul, you're responsible for that soul. That means you have choices to make, and you have to bear the responsibility of those choices. I think it follows naturally from that people have the choice in electing their leaders, because again, it's not supposed to be that other people tell us what to do. Other people aren't going to live my life. They're not going to be responsible for my soul. I am. And if the American experiment, in the history of the world, how have governments happened? Well, sometimes it's a king, sometimes it's a monarchy, sometimes it's an aristocracy, sometimes it's the generals, sometimes it's the clerics. But in America, it's the people. And that's the difference. And whether we can continue to govern ourselves really depends on everybody. Certainly not necessarily the people you see in the media every day. Okay, Kathy, that's enough for you. I rattled on long enough. Oh, here's a good one. William F. from Punta Gorda, Florida. KT, would you accept a position in a second-term Trump presidency? Well, it's interesting that you've asked, William, because it has come up in conversation. And I would just say, let's see. I believe firmly in the Trump revolution that President Trump is leading, but I also believe in the revolution no matter who's leading it. And so if there's a way that I could either officially or unofficially help with that revolution, I would consider it. But I will tell you that, yes, I've had those conversations with people in the White House and in the West Wing of the White House. And I won't go any further than that. Okay, Kathleen, also from Florida. Kathleen, you're really crazy. That's my name too. Would I ever consider running for president? I'm probably a little too old. But I will say that I would consider running for vice president in a heartbeat. That's the best job in Washington. So let's just quickly dispense with that because I don't think either of those are job openings that are available right now. Okay. This is from Tim from Williston, North Dakota. Ooh. Tim, I'm going to have to just take a second to think about your question because what I'm going to write, I've got to sign your book here. Okay, the greatest moment as a true patriot. You know, I think that being a real patriot is when you do stuff that is hard for you to do. And sometimes, as long as I've always believed that if you do the right thing for the right reasons, it'll all work out in the end. But the time in my life that I really doubted that was when I was investigated by the Mueller Commission. Because I'd done nothing wrong. I was doing the right things for the right reasons. But when they wanted me, implied that I should say things about others, implicate others to get off myself, I was really tempted to do that. But with the wise counsel of my husband, a terrific lawyer, Bob Jiffer of Sullivan and Cromwell, I ended up being true to myself. And I think that that was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I'm glad because I'm quite proud. It'll never, make the history books, but I'm very proud that I kept my integrity. So thanks for the question. Okay, John from Allentown, Pennsylvania. Oh, John, this is a really nice question. So I'm going to sign my name right here because I'm so happy you've asked. Katie, I am so glad you're back in sight. Do you plan to continue being visible in this current crazy environment? I hope so. We need intelligent people to get the word out. You bet. So here's the thing, John, when I was in Scotland, in this remote place, right, I can only read books by candlelight, basically, I came across a Scottish ballad, and I kept sort of saying it to myself over and over again. And here's how it goes. It's from, I think, the 1700s. It is, I am hurt, but I am not slain. I will lay me down a while and bleed, and then I will rise and fight again. And so I've laid myself down, I've written my book, and I am absolutely back in the fight, John. And this is the fight of my lifetime, because if we don't get it right, it's over. The country we bequeath to our children and our grandchildren won't be the same. So yeah, I'm back in the fight. And I'm a tough old bird, so I think it's going to be a good fight too. Okay. Ooh. All right, so this person didn't leave their name. And by the way, if you want to have questions, just write them in and we'll get to them, I hope. What can I, as a small person, do to help solve the country's problems? There are no small people in America. I mean, that's the beauty of it, right? We're all created equal, and we all have equal rights, and we all have equal responsibilities. So I think that you're not a small person. You're as big as anyone in this nation. When our founding fathers wrote all the laws that now govern us, whether it's the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they gave rights to everybody. I mean, the guys, the people, the colonials who were sitting in the taverns just drinking ale and smoking their long pipes and who never fought for anything, they had just as many rights as the soldiers who were with George Washington at Valley Forge in the darkest days of the Revolution. And so I think that's the gift we're given by our founding fathers and by our heritage. And the one thing I learned from President Reagan said this very well when he said that freedom is ours, but we don't inherit it in our DNA or in our bloodstream, that every generation has to fight for its freedom. Now, fighting takes a lot of different forms, but the best way to fight is just go to the ballot box and vote. Get involved, get your kids to vote, because I'm convinced that if everybody gets involved, if everybody votes and everybody educates themselves on the issues, even if they disagree with me, the fact that we've all contributed to that we're all in this together, means that we have the cohesiveness that our society needs. You know, we're a melting pot. Everybody's different. Everybody's national origin, religion, geography, it's all different. It's a hodgepodge. So what holds us together, the glue that holds us together, is that notion that we are in this together and we're equal. And no one group has more rights or responsibilities than the other. And so you're not a small person, you're a big person, but you have a responsibility, and that's to get involved. Okay, so next. Oh, this is fun. Okay, again, there's no attribution or a name, but if there was a book you would pick out for my young son to read and inspire him to be a leader, what would that be? Well, first of all, get your son to read. It's the single most important thing you can do. The book that inspired me, and remember, I'm in my late 60s. The book that inspired me was made into a movie in the 1950s and 60s, but it was called Johnny Tremaine. And it's the story of a 14-year-old boy. It's historical fiction, but geared for the teen audience or young teens. And it was about a boy who was an apprentice silversmith to Paul Revere. And it describes all the great people of the founding of the nation: George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and the people that this young boy meets as he's going through his duties to Paul Revere and the experiences he had. So I read it, and I still tear up when I think about it, because you realize that it's very personal. This is not some distant heroes who are doing this. This is average, nice, decent guys who just want to sort of have a life, and yet they all felt compelled to do a little something. They were as you say, the small people. No, they were the average people, and they all rose to great heights. You know, heroes aren't born heroes, and great people are not born great. They become great, and they can particularly become great in America. So I would say Johnny Tremaine. But I would also say that if you want to understand about leadership and the loneliness of leadership and the importance of it, there's some movies that I would recommend. It depends on how old your son is, but any of the Winston Churchill movies that have come out in the last couple of years: Gathering Storm, there's Dunkirk, and they take the example of Winston Churchill, who was Prime Minister of Great Britain during World War II. And he had really had a failed career in a lot of ways. And when he was in his late 60s, he became Prime Minister of Great Britain as they were losing World War II. It was before America entered the war. And Britain was the last country in Europe left after the Nazis had moved into France and obviously Germany, but Italy and all the other countries. So it was only little Britain left. And Winston Churchill goes through a period where he was sure that they thought Britain was going to lose. And all of his advisors said, you've got to seek a peace, you've got to have a compromise with Hitler. And it shows how Churchill was so alone, but he knew what the right thing to do was. And he took a huge gamble, certainly with his own career, but with his country. And it was a gamble that paid off. But I think it's important for people to learn as leaders that it's not just about, being on Air Force One. It's not just the bands and the parades. It's also about making the courageous decisions, which are sometimes the really hard ones, which sometimes you make them and you don't see how they're going to turn out well, but you make them because they're the right thing to do. But I just do want to compliment both you and your son if you want to have him become a leader, because America needs some fresh blood right now, and we need some leaders, and we need some leaders with integrity. So good on you for encouraging him to do that. Okay, so let's go to another question. What have I been doing while in quarantine? Well, I actually have had a terrific lockdown in a lot of ways. My husband and I had planned to go, we live in New York and Long Island, and we had planned to go to Florida to visit our brand new grandson as soon as he was born. He was born March 3rd. So we went to Florida, we flew to Florida. on about March 7th or so. And we thought we'd stay for a week, be a good granny, do the middle of the night feedings, ooh and ah over the grandson. But once we got there, the pandemic started. And so we thought, well, gee, should we go back to New York? Actually, our daughter needed us, and so did our wonderful son-in-law. So we stayed, but we packed for a week. So we had to do a lot of online shopping, I might add. But we stayed for almost we just got back a day or two ago. And for me, it was a great opportunity because otherwise, as a grandparent who's far away from a grandchild, I would have had maybe the odd weekend or vacation where I would have hugged my grandson. But this way I got to know him really well. I got to be there when he had his first smile. And most grandparents don't have that joy in their lives. So for me, it was great. And it was also, I think that I was quite useful because my daughter and son-in-law, this was their first child. And because of lockdown, it wasn't as if they could consult a lot of friends who would say, well, this is how you burp the baby. So I think I was also able to play a useful role in helping guide them through parenthood. And so for me, I became much closer to my children. We talk all the time on Zoom. These are children of mine, and they're all grown, but who haven't paid me the time of day for months. And we were all of a sudden Zooming with each other and communicating with each other and FaceTiming with each other several times a week. So for me, the family became closer. I got the opportunity to really spend quality time with my newest grandson. He is, by the way, the 6th grandchild of mine. And it gave me some time to reflect. I think it gave a lot of Americans time to reflect on how do you want to spend the rest of your life, what's really important, what's not so important. And I think it's gotten us all to pare down and maybe rediscover a couple of values. It has certainly had that effect on me. I hope it has on you guys too. Okay, one more question. Do you believe this country will remain in this divided state regardless of who is president and the majority in the House and the Senate? It's a tough one. I do think we're in for a bit longer of this, just because it hasn't gotten bad enough yet. It's plenty bad between the pandemic and the lockdown and the economic dislocation, and now the social unrest across the country. It's pretty bad. It's certainly the worst it's been in my lifetime. But I don't think it's played out yet. I don't think enough people have said, I've had it already with all you guys. Let's throw all the bums out and go in a different direction. Because what we've now done is it becomes a sin to compromise. And so the incentive is to go in the other direction, is to scream and shout over every little thing. Everything is an outrage. So I do think that we haven't gotten it out of our bloodstream yet. My guess is it'll be a couple more years. And the way we get out of it is from the people at the polls. Okay. What talent do you believe has contributed most to your success? Well, I don't think of myself as an outrageously successful person. I don't think anybody thinks of themselves that way. But I think for me, I grew up, nobody in my family had gone to college. I had to work for everything. I got scholarships and worked really hard. But for me, it was probably hard work and just never quitting. No matter how down you get and how battered around, you just kind of get up and put one foot in front of the other and keep going. Because if you never quit, you can never be defeated, right? Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Yikes, I gotta get going. I've gotta start signing these books. Which organizations should we support to protect our country? Well, I think certainly the military, because the military, even when Americans kind of lose their sense of what's important, the military has always been the repository of our values. I would also support, here's something so we're getting into the 4th of July weekend, right? So this is something it's called the Constitution of the United States. And there's the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In my family, and we started doing this decades ago, we read the Declaration of Independence every 4th of July. And my children, when they were young, they roll their eyes. They thought, oh God, why do we have to do this? All of our buddies are at the beach and they're at picnics or cookouts. Why are we stuck doing homework? But a couple of years ago, we read it, and we go around the table and everybody reads a portion of it. My daughter, who was in the Navy, she'd gone to the Naval Academy, and her then fiance, now husband and father of my brilliant young grandson, they had friends who had just been deployed to Afghanistan and had just come back. And so as we were going around the table, and everyone, our friends, our family, who were reading a paragraph or two, all of a sudden, when you start realizing how angry the people, the Americans were, the Patriots were, at the mother country, Great Britain, and the complaints they had, it sounded all of a sudden, very, very similar, and a lot of the same themes. And so for me, it had a special meaning then, and certainly for members of our family who saw and knew people who were defending the nation and were willing to sacrifice everything for the country. So it reminded me of how great, our Patriot generation was. Okay, they're giving me the signal that I've got just a few minutes left. So I think keep sending in your questions, because I will absolutely get them. And maybe if we do this again, I'll read out your questions. But I wanted to close for these last couple of minutes, especially because we're coming up to the 4th of July, by reading you the last couple of paragraphs of my book, because I think they really have a meaning today. I talk about why America's great. What makes America great? We talk about making America great again. And I talk about the melting pot. We're a melting pot society. We're unique in the world. And to be an American, anybody can be an American. It doesn't matter the color of your skin or your national origin, or whether your ancestors came over on the Mayflower, or they just arrived, and took their oath of citizenship a couple of weeks ago. We're all equal Americans. And that's a strength no other country has. We're a land of opportunity. We have always been at the forefront of innovation and industriousness and can-do attitude. And it's given us great prosperity. And it looks to the future. One of the great things I think about Facebook is that there's always the section of, where are you from? And in any other part of the world, people would write, oh, where they were born. But in America, you write where you are now. And so I think that really says a lot about us. We don't look at the past. We look to the future. We hopefully learn some lessons from the past, but we don't dwell there. We don't keep those angers and animosities and prejudices and vendettas that other countries do that go back centuries. So I think those are the three, among many, reasons that we are a great nation. But I talk about what makes us an exceptional nation. I refer to the fact that years ago there was a Republican debate, and the debate moderator asked the candidates, do you believe in American exceptionalism? Duh. Well, every Republican candidate immediately raised his hands. There was not a second of hesitation. And the moderator, I thought, missed a great opportunity, because he should have then followed up by saying, why? What do you think is exceptional about America? Because, there are plenty of people, President Obama's even said it, Hillary Clinton, who talk about America as full of deplorables, or, some percentage of the American population is no good, or, America, all the things that they say. I don't have to repeat them, them. But what I did try to do was answer the question. And America is a great nation for all the reasons, but we're exceptional for one. We have within our hands the power of regeneration. We can reinvent ourselves as a nation, just as we can reinvent ourselves as individuals. It doesn't happen automatically or as a matter of right. Once we come to realize our leaders are out of step with the people, we can't just stumble along and keep doing what we've always done because it's familiar and comfortable. We have to earn it. We have to go through our catharsis. We have to adapt. We have to change. I believe that it is what we have done during these periods of creative destruction throughout our history, beginning with the first time we shook off the governing class with the Declaration of Independence and Revolutionary War. And as I said, we did it again and again. We enter each one of these periods with a growing dissatisfaction with Washington and the powers that be. The dissatisfaction grows and forms a national grassroots movement of the people against the status quo governing class. We battle it out in town halls across the country, in the halls of Congress, and finally in our presidential elections. Sometimes we have even fought it out on the battlefield. These periods are not harbingers of our doom or signs of the end of American greatness, even though the establishments of the day always have called them that. Indeed, they are to be welcomed as the very essence of what's unique about America. They are how we renew and regenerate, how we disrupt the stale government elites and sweep them out of office and make a fresh start. What emerges at the other end of these periods is a nation reborn, one that keeps some of the old and some of the new. We evolve and we reinvent America. Our Constitution gives us the right to do it and provides the means by which we do it. Our dynamic American society demands it. Our technological, entrepreneurial, and innovative nature gives us what we need to make it possible. And our tendency to find great leaders just when we need them the most is what carries us through these periods of transformation. It is our shared belief that all men are created equal and have the right and the ability to govern themselves. That's what motivates us to persevere through tumultuous times. These periods are our lifeblood and they're our legacy. And they are what has always propelled us to the future. And they are uniquely American. Perhaps Lincoln said it best in the darkest days of the Civil War, that our country gets a new birth of freedom. So look around you. The future's in your hands. It is not up to a group of elites or a permanent governing class of self-appointed saviors to reinvent America for the 21st century. It is up to average, common, regular American citizens. We are the people whose task it is to bring about America's next revolution. And that's why our Declaration of Independence, signed on July 4th, 1776, a document that launched the greatest experiment in the history of all mankind, is founded on the belief that all men are created equal. And then a decade later, having won our independence, our founding fathers drafted a 6-page Constitution, which continues to guide us on the path of constant renewal. It begins with these 3 simple yet earth-shaking words: we the people. I hope you've enjoyed this. And if you haven't yet ordered your copy of my book, Revolution, Trump, Washington, and We the People, please do. Go to premiercollectibles.com/revolution. And now I'll spell it for you because it's an interesting, different spelling. It's Premier, Premiere, collectibles.com, revolution. I wish you all the best. I thank you so much for your support and being willing to do this unusual, circumstantial bit of communication during the period of the pandemic and lockdown. And I wish you all just the greatest 4th of July, and have this be a new birth of freedom for America too. Thank you very much.